Well, hello again. This is the America 250 A History, the podcast. I'm here today with my colleague, Beverly Gage, who has just started delivering her portion of the lectures. This course is going way too fast. I gave my last lecture this week on Tuesday. Bev took over today, brilliantly, I might add, all about immigration. John Freeman cannot join us today. She'll be back next week. So it's just Bev and I having at it here. Bev, let's start with the reading you chose for this week. And I want to appreciate you for that because I had never read Mary Anton's The Promised Land. And it is a great read. Students and others out there, if you are still trying to finish the book or the chapters that were assigned, get after it. It's a beautiful, granular memoir of a young woman when she writes it. Right? She writes this, publishes it in 1912. She was born in 1881, immigrates to America when she's about 12 years old, I think. It's very much the story of a Jewish immigrant, a Jewish family's immigration to America, to Boston in particular. But it's about many other things, and I found it beautifully written, hauntingly written at the same time. It's quite upbeat for what could become a pretty dark story. So why did you choose this book? You know something about its history and how it has been taught for years or used to be taught even more. It's a great example of that genre of the Jewish immigrant memoir. So why Mary Anton?
It's true that this is a book that was a big seller, a big point of reference in its day, and then for about a generation, as I understand it, was assigned in history class, in civics classes in particular, which we don't tend to have anymore. And then after the 1940s and 50s really fell out of fashion. And so I have been struck when I've been speaking with other historians, even people who study the late 19th, early 20th century and onward, and they ask what I assigned for the class. And I mention this book and they say, oh, I've never read it. And so
I never have.
I think there were a couple
and I'm writing about a person who's right in that era now, and I'm glad I've read it now.
Right. And I think it's interesting. So in part, I think her story that is about assimilation or the attempt at assimilation is about the embrace of a certain kind of Americanism that itself fell out of a certain kind of fashion later in the 20th century. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to assign this book was not only that it's a really good book by a very young person recounting, exactly the experiences that many students have had recently of high school and trying to go to college and figure out your life, but that, in fact, it's a glimpse onto an immigration politics in that moment that was both similar and different because she wrote that book deliberately to intervene in a very impassioned set of debates that were underway about immigrants, their role in American society, in her case, Jewish immigrants in particular. But she makes this big bid at the opening to say, this is my story. I'm a woman. I'm a Jewish immigrant. I came from Russia, but this is actually some sort of universal story. This is some sort of bigger story. And she really wants to make that leap.
And it's kind of it's an embrace of the American dream that, at least in her version of her story, works with a lot of stumbles along the way for her family, her father, for example. But she is embracing that. She says at one point, America is my dream, or became my dream.
Well, she's embracing it and she's writing it, right?
Oh, yeah.
So she's embedded in this community in Boston, but then in other places like New York, of progressives and of women who are trying to write that narrative into American history. The book's actually dedicated, I don't know if you noticed this, to Josephine Lazarus, who I believe is the sister of Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem on, they're related somehow. I think they're sisters, but so it's this generation of people who are actually both reflecting and then generating this story about, that's an aspirational story, as much about what they want the United States to be as what it actually is in their lives.
One of the things I loved about reading it is the granular nature of it. You begin with this, she's just a young girl. It's her invention of her memories of a childhood. And that's what memoir writing is. We're trying to remember childhood, early adulthood, and so on. And when I was working on Douglas all those years, I actually started reading a bunch of child psychology to try to understand, well, what do we remember of childhood? Of course, that didn't give me all the answers because we don't entirely know. Memory is so elusive and so complex. But we remember especially associations, those poignant moments, those powerful moments, those sometimes violent moments. But what I liked about this was the granular character of her own memory, what she's going to wear, if she has something to wear, what they're eating, what the street was like, how far she walked, what this city, her Podolsk or whatever that town was called in Belarus, but then the next city she goes to and the next city she goes to, the fear of Russia. It's a developing sort of story, and you see things on the ground. I don't know exactly what kind of training she had as a writer, except her reading, her education, and then her experience reading must have been a key background here. But she has to have read a lot of really good novelists and so on, who are good at this kind of detail, because it's all over the book.
Well, she does describe herself as the kind of classic nerd kid, right? Which I also thought maybe Yale students would relate to.
Well,
the kid who, the kid in the family who is reading the books, who is
who's lousy at everything else, but wants
sees
to go
a different
read.
world through books, can't actually manage to clean the house or get the other jobs done, but sees this. And I guess there were a couple of things too that I thought about the way that she constructed her story that really resonated for me with some of the Black writers, not only of this period, but of a figure like Douglas, because you can see them both struggling to tell a story about a childhood that is in a place and in a world that they cannot go back to.
Can I go back?
And they have to think it through and begin to experience it then through stories, through family, not only through their own memories, but through these kind of constructed narratives around them. And then I was also struck by the resonance in how she describes her experiences in Russia, and then how she describes, I forget what the phrase is she uses. She doesn't call it double consciousness.
No, she calls it double association.
Double associations.
Just like Du Bois.
Very resonant. Du Bois writing at the same time. And those moments describing coming of age as a Jewish girl in the Russian Empire and realizing, oh, there are different laws, there are different ideas, there are these lines. It's so resonant with the way people describe growing up under Jim Crow.
Sure. And in Du Bois and Souls of Black Folk, here's a brilliant young man who's entirely the creation of his education, mostly, which was a great education. I mean, he had as good an education as you could ever have imagined in the late 19th century. But also lives within a veil, as he famously said, lives within the expectation of being a problem, as he famously said. Mary Anton is always worried about the next step, how she's perceived. Can she do this? Well, from her presentation of herself, of course she can. She always can, which tends to be what most memoirists do. They make themselves into a character on the way to some kind of success. I'd love to see a writing assignment that somehow called for this sort of comparative work if we were in a I don't know, comparative history course or even a literature course, we could try that. I love the moment when she sees her first bookstore and then learns that there are actually people who have houses with even more books than a bookstore. I mean, a kid who loves books but doesn't have many, if any, that's her American dream,
and
frankly.
I think that she really manages to capture, one of the things that's striking to me about the Gilded Age and especially the Progressive Era, this period, there's a lot of worry about all sorts of things that are going on, immigration and labor strife and conflict, and as we'll talk about next week, what people used to call the social question, which was basically, is society going to hang together or not, or are we just descending into another civil war, a revolution?
And what is equality in this era? It's being redefined all the time,
right?
Or destroyed.
But one of the features of that era is that people also had this incredible faith in the future.
Yeah.
Right? So the Progressive Era, this word progressive, has the idea of progress embedded in it. And so they're just these visions that, with the right plan, with the right politics, the future is going to be so much better than the present. And I think that's something we've lost in our own politics at the moment.
21st century we have.
And that's one of the things that's really lovely about
Maybe that's why I loved reading it.
It might be, right?
know.
That she is filled
so much
with
hope in this.
And aspiration. And also, you said confidence, right? Not only confidence in herself, but confidence in the ability of the United States of America or humanity more broadly. People love to make these big declarations about humanity during this period, is going to do things better as time goes on. And she is saying that as a woman, right? As a woman who cannot vote during this period. It's very hard in some ways for women to access this kind of public voice. But she herself just kind of goes for it. And
she's so strong, you would forget, really, that it's a time of terrible discrimination against women. Property owning, you only own property if it was your husband's property. But she discovers something called the public school. Talk about that a minute, because, as one of my pet peeves is, and this is the era where the public school is much older than this, but it really takes hold in this period and becomes a big part of the contention over immigration. How do you use the public school to assimilate all these wildly weird people? There's that sentence where she says, and father says education is free. And I think, oh, here it comes. She's going to go to a public school. Transforms her. Yeah.
My favorite moment in the book is when her immigrant father, who does not speak English or speaks very, very little English, takes his children to the public school for the first time, takes these little kids and stands them in front of this teacher. And this teacher, the kids also barely speak any English. But the teacher sees them and she recognizes them and she recognizes the meaning of this moment. And he hands his children to this teacher. And it's just an amazing moment, both because she writes it very well, but because it is this moment that is about faith in a certain kind of publicness and a certain kind of civic and common culture that was very much the vibe of the Progressive Era, although it often wasn't realized. And, the Progressive Era is, as you said, public schools and the idea of public schools have been around for quite a while at that point, and actually was often associated as being a particularly American idea, right? That these schools are going to be essential to democracy, to a successful democracy. So all those anxieties that Joanne's folks had and your folks, right? The public school was going to be essential. And what's happening now in this moment are two things. One is that what they would have called higher education is becoming more available, but that in most cases means high school at this moment, but the public high school is just coming into being as this kind of font of not only education, but social mobility. And then the schools are charged, as you say, and as she reflects, with being these engines of quote unquote Americanization. And that's quite a complicated enterprise. But she just throws herself into that, right? I mean, she writes her first essay about George Washington and the American Revolution, right? I mean, she is in it. She's in it in that sense.
Well, and if you think about the 30-something-year-old writer, she's barely 30, in retrospect, imagining the pivots of her life, there's many pivots in this story, but going to that school with her dad and being handed off to she couldn't wait for the lessons, as she called them, going to school. She couldn't wait to read. That sounds so much like cliches, but not to immigrants. That's where the dream really.
Well, and it's another point of resonance with Douglass, right? I mean, that the story about literacy and the power of literacy and the ability to speak and write and participate, therefore, in this broader conversation. And so The Promised Land came out in 1912, which in many ways is sort of the peak of these kinds of hopes and aspirations. On Tuesday, we're going to talk about the 1912 election, talk about this period that is just
the four-way election.
Profusion of ideas about how you're going to make things better. And then certainly on immigration, that story starts to get much darker quite quickly after this. And, so I think in that sense, it's also a little bit of a glimpse into the fact that none of us ever know what's coming next. So she published that book in 1912. She thought she understood the world she was in. And then 2 years later, World War I started, and it just threw the whole globe into chaos, rewrote all sorts of things, and for the United States,
of Europe and much of the rest of the world,
exactly, and for the United States on immigration, produced a real backlash that lasted, and that was in many ways the subject of the lecture.
I can't help saying I'm writing a new biography of James Weldon Johnson. Well, his great novel, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, was published in 1912, which is often called the first modernist black novel. He thinks he's anticipating overcoming this and that and this and that, I think. But, oh God, what's to follow in terms of American race relations and racial violence in the wake of that? But anyway, okay. Well, since you brought up World War I, we're going to return to the 1890s in a minute or two here. But, her book comes out in 1912. The European world is going to collapse in this insane all-out war in a matter of only a few months in Europe. And by 1915 is going to have trenches dug for hundreds of miles in a war no one had fully anticipated at all. Born of militarism and imperialism and nationalism. But it becomes a war because it was so vast, so big, so bloody, and so disillusioning because of that somehow it had to be for something higher. And that higher thing was, according to Woodrow Wilson and many others, was supposed to be democracy. Make the world safe for democracy, remake the world with democracy. All those empires and those empires are going to die, mostly, except the British. But democracy is now at stake, and it draws the human imagination somehow that you couldn't have this vast of a kind of killing for so long without something as a higher result. It's a moment of the transition of countries, borders, culture, how we even think about mourning, how we think about literature. Film comes out of this era. It has enormous cultural impact. as it does on this thing called progressivism, which I know you're going to deal with next week. But American immigration just is shut off by the war after this period of tremendous numbers, 28 million down to about 18, 20 in the past, 40 years, 50 years? So it shuts off immigration, and it causes this kind of disarray in who's who and what's what and what's an American now. Mm-hmm. It's going to have a tremendous impact on Black Americans. It's something I've written about and taught about. But talk about this period for a moment. The Great War, as it was known, changed everything for a while.
The United States had this very distinctive experience in World War I think it's safe to say.
Short,
so first of all, the United States was not in the war formally for very long, and we'll talk a little bit more about the actual experience of the war. But the war started in the summer of 1914, and it was almost 3 full years before the United States declared war. So that's April of 1917. And then the war was over by November of 1918. So the United States is really only involved for a year and a half, is really only actively fighting the war for about half of that time. Nonetheless, it touches every aspect of American society. And I think one of the things that's interesting about World War I is, like many wars, it is just full of contradictions and paradoxes. But these are particularly heightened, I think. As you said, we're fighting a war for democracy, but the way we're going to have to do that is to repress speech and dissent at home. So World War I is a disaster for civil liberties in the United States, and in fact produces the need for things like the ACLU and a civil liberties consciousness, because the speech laws, the deportations, the jailings are so draconian in World War I. And there are many people at the time who
editors, anyone with an alternative view of society.
Famous political dissenters. Eugene Debs runs from federal prison for president in 1920 because he had been jailed for criticizing the U.S. government. So you've got a war for democracy, but you've got all this repression at home. And you have this war that is supposed to be about America and Americanism. And yet you've got all these anxieties about the fact that about 15% of the United States at that point in its history are foreign-born. And you've got people with all sorts of histories and all sorts of loyalties and all sorts of backgrounds.
A large percentage of those were Germans.
There were many Germans, right? Germans and Irish had come early on. And then this period of mass immigration that we were talking about today, primarily Jews from Eastern Europe and Italians and other Southern Europeans. And so on the one hand, you have these brash declarations of, America striding forth on the world stage. And then these deep anxieties at home about, what does that even mean? What's American? Who's American? Who can be counted on? Who's going to fight this war?
Who's 100% American?
Correct.
That was the phrase.
Correct.
And the posters. God, the poster art of World War I is itself a whole topic. And you showed a couple today. It was beautiful. It was great. Well, on the German question, this may be a moment to say a word about our own backgrounds here, since the lecture today was primarily on immigration. My German grandparents were born in Germany, northern Germany. They emigrated around 1896. I was raised in an industrial city in the Midwest, Flint, Michigan. There was a lot of German spoken around me as a child. We went to a German Lutheran church, which had a German service and an English service, lots of German immigrants. But they, of course, had to lay low. And my own grandfather, it turns out, was a draft dodger, as I later learned, and was forced into the U.S. Army and had his photograph taken in a doughboy uniform, which always made no sense to me until some old cousin of his explained it. But then as I grew up, well after World War II, my mother and my grandparents didn't want me to ever learn a word of German, because by then they'd had 2 world wars fought against Germany. And yet this enormous impact of German culture on foodways and all the rest on America was as much as any European immigrant group. And yet I was never to learn a word of German. Now, you've had a similar family background, which is more Eastern Europe and Jewish.
Right. So, well, on the Germany and World War I question, it is this intense period of repression, not only of German people, but of German culture in the United States. So German nationals end up in internment camps, about 10,000 of them, right? So it's a pretty substantial thing.
The rehearsal for the Japanese internment was done in World War I.
The Japanese internment is done differently in important ways that we will get to. But yeah, it was a sort of trial run. There's a lot of violence against Germans, including lynchings of German nationals. And then there's all of this kind of cultural profusion, this repression of the German language. One of the local
and music
examples of music and all of that sort of thing. So these are, the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra was interned because he did not want to stop playing German music and spoke out in favor
what do you do with Bach in the repertoire?
Of German, well, I mean, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner. I mean, like, it's a real problem for classical music. And I believe, I don't know if this is a true story, but up the road from New Haven, there is a town called, if you look at it on paper, called Berlin. But around here, it's pronounced Berlin. And I've been told that it's because of World War I. And they didn't entirely change the name, but they changed the pronunciation so it wouldn't be associated there. So that is a real intensity of experience. My own family's experience was a kind of Mary Anton experience on my father's side. So I come from this big family of Eastern European Jews who came in the 1880s and 1890s. And, my father had his own, he was born in the United States, actually in the middle of World War I. So that tells you he was quite old when I was born.
So was mine.
I am not as old.
No, you're much younger than me.
If your parents were born then, my parents. So my father was just really old when I was born. So don't read too much into that. But, he grew up in a world of kind of Jewish assimilationism and came of age in the 1930s, all of which is to say that his family last name was Goldberger, and he changed it in the 1930s as a kind of move to avoid anti-Semitism and to assimilate into American society. And I have always been very amused that he chose, the most British name he could think of. And it was this British general who, almost ruined the American Revolution, General Gage. Right. So
you got anglicized into a Gage.
Exactly. Wow. So, but I do not have roots in the American Revolution. That's just that's a little bit of Mary Anton fakery, I think.
Well, and in your lecture today, you obviously made the point that what was at stake in this period was the great story or great myth of the melting pot. And, of course, that's led to poetry and song and all kinds of cultural representations. What was this idea of the melting pot, and what happened to it over time? Because it's no longer the way certainly professional historians approach immigration, but it still has a powerful hold on us.
Yeah, it was one of the great metaphors of this particular moment in American history, and then has revivals in later moments as well. But I think, as you say, we're not in either in our contemporary politics or even in the way that we think about what it means to live in a diverse, multiracial society. The melting pot is not usually the metaphor we turn to, but it was one of the metaphors of this period. And I would say, it kind of had two pieces to it. One was like something that would happen at Henry Ford's factories, where he'd have all his workers get dressed in their native and traditional costumes from their home countries, and they'd be there, and then there would literally be a giant pot in the middle of the stage, and they would take the steps down because he was teaching English and Americanization classes. They would go down into the melting pot, and then they would all come out the other side in identical, like, modern suits carrying American flags, right?
Ford was a showman, and not always for the right reason.
There is a totally kind of erase the old ways, embrace the new ways version of that is purely assimilationist. But there's also a melting pot story that says, here's the big pot, everyone hop in, everybody's bringing something different. Sure. Everybody is going to flavor the proverbial soup in a different way. Right. And what makes it great is that we're all in it together. And I think that's kind of the range of the melting pot approaches.
Yeah. And yet, at the same time, as you pointed out in your lecture, and you will come back to, I know, next week, this is also an era of violence against some groups of immigrants, Italians, darker peoples from Eastern Europe, Jews, who even the Irish, who people didn't consider white at first. They were somehow a darker breed of the British Isles. So the melting pot was always, like many great myths, it's always violating itself as it's growing. I mean, think of any great, deep American myth. It's always being contradicted, which is probably how it became a myth.
Well, this period is just so stark in its language of democracy and aspiration and reform, which we're going to talk more about next week. But even in these surges of peoples coming to the United States from all over the world to some degree, mainly Europe, but not exclusively, and then this kind of tightening net, right? All sorts of people being written out of access to the United States or access to American citizenship. And that's happening through Jim Crow in the South. It's happening out west for American Indians. It's happening ultimately in terms of European immigration. It's happening with Asian immigration. And so what this really is this period when kind of questions about American citizenship, who belongs, either in terms of race or ideas or political orientation, is just being sorted and resorted. And these lines that are getting drawn are sometimes vicious lines. They're not just law, but they are violence often as well.
Well, and no line more stark than what we came to call Jim Crow. Now, we might revisit that for a moment, its roots and development. I touched on it in my last lecture, but this system, I called it, many now have called it, an American apartheid. It was and an apartheid in the sense that South Africa was. In every structure of society, every institution of society, from schooling to politics to religion, name your institution, the races were to be kept separate. Now, Americans are doing this for various reasons, and it has everything to do with Reconstruction and its falling apart or defeat. But here was this now growing, huge population of Black Americans. It's going to double from the end of the Civil War to the 1890s, more than double. There will be between 9 and 10 million African Americans. Speaking of groups within this pluralism, they're the largest by far, and yet increasingly defined out. Now, I talked in my lecture about some of the reasons, the origins of this. The populist movement scared the hell out of white Southern Democrats. The rise of lynching has to do with economic competition in town after town, region after region of the South. It has to do with this so-called rape myth, the allegation of sexual assault or rape against Black men with white women, the excuse, as Frederick Douglass famously called it. And it leads to a kind of savagery that was new in the use of violence, and it was political violence. A lynching in a town was a message to all Black people, especially when 5,000 or 10,000 people turn out to watch it, and no one is punished. Now, it's happening at the same time as the development of the Jim Crow laws. And once Jim Crow starts to enter the legal system, it becomes increasingly vast and rigid. The first kind of Jim Crow laws of the late 19th century were disfranchisement, to keep blacks from voting. And they tended to do it. Mississippi was the first state in 1890, and they are then followed by other Deep South states throughout the 1890s and into the early 20th century, all across the South, and to some degree even other states, border states, even in the West. But then Jim Crow began to enter city life where blacks and whites come together more, schools, transportation. Churches didn't need laws to segregate them.
Restaurants,
right? Any kind of public facility. And then eventually anything that black and white people might encounter each other at, like an amusement park, water fountains, on and on and on. But specific laws, hundreds and hundreds of them passed by state legislatures, to the point of absurdity when we look back on it. But it shows you how desperate, as were the Afrikaners in South Africa, to separate their gene pool, their blood, their society from black people. It also was a system, once you see it in operation, that was meant to humiliate a people. Experiencing a Jim Crow car, experiencing a Jim Crow school, being Jim Crowed, as it was so often called, was meant to humiliate you. It was meant to remind you, you're not just different, you're inferior, you're not a citizen in this society. And that system is put in place. It gives for our students a sense of what was to be overcome in the modern civil rights movement. It's generations of people having to live under this. It also meant, and then I'll turn it over to you, but it also meant that beneath this system, next to this system, with this system, black people had to learn to live. They had to learn to develop alternative economies. They had an alternative spiritual life. They built neighborhoods. They owned businesses. They whole business districts of southern cities and towns that were there because of Jim Crow. And we've got a lot of scholarship on. There have been great books done on certain cities, like Hattiesburg, Mississippi. There was a recent book on Hattiesburg, showed the whole history of Jim Crow and the way black communities developed. It's the same thing immigrant communities did. Italian communities, Jewish communities, Hungarian communities with their own foodways and their own religion, their own churches and so on. But blacks had to do it as Native Americans, frankly. They've been here for centuries. Right. And their roots are in something called slavery, not in amidst Russian pogroms, but there's a reason in which some scholars of the black experience have suggested, this is always a little bit of a contentious issue, but that the black experience in America should be treated as part of the immigrant experience. Because there have been all kinds of internal immigrations, and there surely was an external immigration. But the two histories are not always mixed that well. Anyway, it's all over this period, the way in which this American apartheid can even be applied beyond the racial line to all sorts of other peoples.
Well, your description reminds me of what the historian Glenda Gilmore used to say, great Southern historian who used to teach here at Yale. And she just always said in her great North Carolina accent that, the thing about Jim Crow is that it was hard work to maintain those lines, and that we tend to tell a story about Jim Crow. Oh, there was Plessy versus Ferguson, and then the laws got passed, and then that's it. But actually, every moment, every interaction was legislated, was fraught, and had all of these implications. And I think you're right that there are ways to see how that kind of hierarchical thinking, those kinds of worries about contamination of blood across race, right? Those get played out in the way that the United States is dealing with new waves of immigrants. So it's most dramatic in Chinese exclusion and in what comes to be much broader Asian exclusion that happens during this period, but in the practices as well, right? So lynching is overwhelmingly aimed at Black men in the South, but not exclusively. And there are famous lynchings in this period. One is the lynching of Leo Frank in Atlanta, who was a Jewish factory manager accused of having. It was, I believe, 1913 or so, and then the lynching was 1915. So you have that. You have the lynchings of Italians in New Orleans. And so some of these practices are spreading out into other parts of American society. And a lot of the racial logic that is behind Jim Crow is also making all of these distinctions between different populations from Europe, not just, white, Asian, Black, but how are the Teutonics different from the Anglo-Saxons, different from the Semitics? And so you've got this deep anxiety in this period about race, much more broadly constructed. And then you have the rise that we talked about today of a whole new language of scientific racism and eugenics that are driving all of this. I mean, I should say that what ultimately happens in the United States in 1924 around immigration on the other side of World War I is the famous 1924 National Origins Act, or Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, which is a fascinating case study in the desire to go back in time.
Go back in time.
Right. So
they're going to make America great again in 1924.
Well, it has that vibe to it, doesn't it?
Oh,
exactly.
Most America First, Make America Great Again moments in our history, and there's been more than one, have something to do with race. It has something to do with putting this thing back in some racial order that the assumption being that we once had this.
Rarely do they happen as baldly as it did in 1924. Because what they say, what the United States says in 1924 is, we want immigration from this moment onward to not only have a very low cap overall, but to have quotas by national origin. And we are going to base those quotas on what the United States looked like in 1890. So before those waves of Eastern and Southern Europeans came along. And it is just a really fascinating and pernicious attempt to kind of re-engineer the society back to some imagined past, to some pure past, some moment when things were great. But they actually put it in law in this case, and that was the immigration regime of the United States for the next 40 years, more or less.
Right, and you made a great point today about how this was trying to resurrect a time that really wasn't as accurate as they thought it was to begin with. America was very diverse in 1890, but not nearly as diverse as they were going to be by the 1920s. But you also made the point that this was about ideology, too, not just race. I mean, it is about gene pools and this naturalization of blood, this idea that somehow race is about blood and biology. But this was about ideology because there was anarchism in Europe coming here. There was socialism. These isms have been around in the United States since Reconstruction, or even before. And you had to stop these peoples, these kinds of peoples, because they were bringing radical ideology with them.
I wrote a book a long time ago now about just this question, and it was primarily about a bomb attack that occurred on Wall Street in 1920, and it was a huge terrorist attack. It killed almost 40 people, shut down the financial markets.
A wagon full of dynamite.
A wagon full of dynamite, and it was never solved. But what was so interesting to me, and one of the reasons that I got interested in that, was that it was this shocking event, and I had never heard of it when I started researching it. I hadn't either until I read
your book when we hired you.
But the people at the time, when they saw this big bomb go off on Wall Street, they said, "Oh, not again, of course." And so I wanted to figure out what they were talking about. And what they were talking about it turns out, was 40 years, even more, of not only battles over ideology, but over these really violent events that had happened throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. The Haymarket bombing, the assassination of William McKinley, the bombing of the Los Angeles Times.
Shooting of Garfield.
The shooting of Garfield even earlier. And so one of the things that emerges, and I think gets a little left out of the restriction story, how and why did we start restricting immigration, were all these fears about radical groups, violence, but particularly the potential for some kind of class revolution in the United States. People are worried about this. They think that it might happen, and they think that the Russians are bringing in communist ideas and that the Italians are bringing in anarchist ideas, and this is a big part of why restriction happens. And one of the things that you see in the teens and 20s is that it's not just at the federal level, deportation raids, these new laws, but that at the state level too, you're starting to get new loyalty legislation. People are being kicked out of, socialists are being kicked out of their duly elected seats in the state legislatures. And so it's a moment of reaction in all sorts of ways. It's racial reaction, it's reaction against a certain openness to the world, and it is a reaction against these kinds of radical ideas.
You're probably going to talk about this next week. The first Red Scare comes right after World War I. Then we have a second huge Red... Well, actually, the Red Scare never went away in the 20s, and especially the 30s. But a huge one, of course, again in the 40s and 50s, McCarthyism. It led to intermittent uses of loyalty oaths. When I was hired for my first job in the Flint public schools, and I'll give the date, 1971, I'd take a loyalty oath to the United States and its Constitution or something.
Well, we are going to...
Of course, I did it. I wanted the job, But loyalty oaths go right back to this era. And your man at that earliest version of the FBI, say a word about that. You brought him up today. You might bring him up again because he lasted damn near the whole 20th century. J. Edgar Hoover helps create this thing, this federal investigation bureau to monitor American thought, American activity. What's an American? The FBI was going to tell you. Explain a little about that moment when Hoover is beginning to become Hoover.
Right. I brought him up just mostly as a warning to everyone.
Well, okay.
He was probably going to come up a lot. But yeah, what really got me interested in thinking about him and wanting to write a biography of him was precisely this, that he, was kind of born into this world we were talking about today. He graduated from law school in 1917 and was just brought in as a young man and then became kind of the great avatar.
He's a product of World War I.
Whole world of federal surveillance of ideas, surveillance of people who were racially suspect, and really spent his whole life immersed not only in building a certain part of the federal government, which we're going to talk a lot about, but also in kind of policing who was legitimate, who deserved to be here, who deserved the full rights of American citizenship. And that seemed to me, particularly around this question of anti-communism, which starts to become so big in this moment, is something that's one of the defining features of the 20th century. And so that's where we're headed over the course of the next few weeks.
And that communist movement or party was a real thing in America.
Oh, yeah. We're going to get there,
we'll
too.
Get there, too.
We'll get there.
They weren't just a total phantom, nor were they perhaps always as dangerous as some people thought. However, yes, and what's at stake here, I'll give you the last word, what's at stake here in the early 20th century in the hands of the progressives who are always trying to reform cities and bring stability to all this new modernity and on and on and on, make life safer for immigrants, and then all kinds of reforms that are going to come out of the New Deal and the Great Depression. It's this pluralism of America. I mean, the term became popular or certainly used a lot. Randolph Bourne and other writers began to use this term to describe America, that its essence was its pluralism. And today, a lot of us still argue that's who we are. We're the most pluralistic nation anyone's ever attempted. But all the issues that come along with that, it's from this period where we see this being practiced. And it always has contradictions. It always, what did I say about the whole racial story of the late 19th century? There's always injustice with justice. It's one feeds on the other. But pluralism is at the basis of all of this. I mean, how plural could the United States actually become? This year is going to give us answers to that.
Yeah, I think it's really an important word to have out there, although many of the people in the progressive era who believed in it were really deeply hurt, disillusioned, including Mary Anton by the 1920s. She's just like, okay, well, this is cooked, right? I have, like, my hopes are dashed. Poor Randolph Bourne died in the flu pandemic, which we haven't even touched on,
right?
But I will get to
1919
a little bit.
Turned around a lot of things.
A little bit next week. And I think, another feature that's always been interesting to me, and maybe we can just end on this note, is that Joanne talked, and you talked in your lectures about this kind of American romance with our own origin story, right? This revolution, this anti-imperial revolution. And one of the things that you see happening in this period is, first of all, Americans saying, well, maybe we want to actually become an empire in a formal sense, right? So that's part of the politics, but also really a turn against the idea of revolution itself, right? Saying, well, when we say that we're a country born in revolution, and a lot of the revolutionaries this period, like Emma Goldman, they're going around, they're quoting Thomas Jefferson, blood of tyrants, eternal vigilance, all of these sorts of things. And they're trying to claim that. But it's clear that American politics and society is saying, no. That kind of revolution is fine. Your kind of revolution is not acceptable at all.
It's exactly the same debate we had to have, of course, about the Civil War. There's your revolution, my brother's the Confederate Revolution, and there's the Emancipation Revolution. This, we had to clean, we as a culture had to clean up that Civil War a lot in order to make it steady, make it stable. And all this new immigration was a great threat to that. Boy, we could go on with this one forever, as we could all of our podcasts, but we've just run out of time.
Next week, we're going to blow through the first 30 years, even 40 years of the 20th century.
But it's only going to get to be more fun.
We're going to visit progressivism.
Yes.
We're going to visit the New Deal next week and talk about what those ideas really were.
Stay tuned, because Bev Gage is going to explain what a progressive was during the progressive movement. Now, progressives have become a lot of other things, but stay tuned for next week. Well, thank you. That's our latest edition of the podcast for America at 250. Thanks. Keep reading out there, and see you next week.